She didn't fall from her horse. She was dragged behind one by a rope tied to her ankles across a quarter-mile of rock and gravel until the man holding the other end decided she'd learned her lesson. The whole town of Redstone Crossing knew it, and the whole town of Redstone Crossing looked her in the eye and called it an accident. Because the man who did it was Gavin Mercer, and his father owned everything: the mine, the sheriff, and every soul too afraid to tell the truth. Clara Whitlock was 22 years old, burning with fever, and completely alone. Until a trapper came down from the mountains and refused to pretend he didn't see what he saw. If you've ever been let down by the people who were supposed to protect you, this story is for you. Watch until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The telegraph office in Redstone Crossing sat at the east end of Main Street, wedged between a feed store and a land broker's office that always seemed to have fresh paint on its sign no matter what else in town was falling apart. It was a narrow building, barely wide enough for a desk, a stool, a small iron stove, and the clicking machine that connected this raw, half-finished mining settlement to the rest of the world. Clara Whitlock had worked that machine for 14 months. She knew the rhythms of the wire the way some women knew the rhythms of a loom. She could transcribe a message in her sleep. She could send one faster than any operator in the territory, or so said the district supervisor the one time he'd passed through and bothered to check. It was not glamorous work, it was not well-paid work, but it was hers. And in 1881, in a place like Redstone Crossing, a 22-year-old woman who could hold a job and hold her own was considered, at best, a curiosity, and at worst, a problem waiting to happen. Clara had grown up 2 days' ride north, in a smaller settlement that the mine boom had since swallowed and forgotten. Her father had been a postal worker. Her mother had taught her to read before she was 5 and to distrust smooth-talking men before she was 10. She had come to Redstone Crossing following a job notice, a small leather bag over her shoulder and about $12 in her coat pocket. She had not expected to love the work. She had loved it anyway. That was before the night of October 4th. She didn't like to think about it in a straight line. Memory didn't cooperate with that kind of order when the thing you were remembering was bad enough. What she had were pieces: the smell of whiskey and horse sweat, the sound of boots on the wooden walkway behind the office, Gavin Mercer's voice, which she had always found too loud, too certain of itself, saying something she couldn't hear clearly over the blood rushing in her ears. Then a rope. Then gravel against her cheek, then her shoulder, then the back of her legs, then everything else, the whole length of her body scraped across the earth like she was something that needed to be cleaned off a boot. She had passed out somewhere on the trail between the edge of town and the mining road. She did not know for how long. When she woke up, it was past midnight. The stars were very clear and very cold and completely indifferent. She had dragged herself, inch by inch, back toward the lights of town, and by the time Deputy Crane found her near the water trough at the edge of Main Street, she was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking against each other like the telegraph keys. She had told him exactly what happened. Deputy Crane had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had said, "Miss Whitlock, you must have taken quite a fall off that horse." She hadn't owned a horse in 6 months. That had been 11 days ago. The infection set in on the 4th day. The rope burns around her ankles, which she had wrapped herself with strips torn from an old petticoat because no one had offered to help her properly, had gone from raw and weeping to something darker and hotter to the touch. The skin around them had turned an ugly reddish purple at the edges, tight and swollen, and the pain had stopped being a sharp thing and had become instead a constant, deep, bone-level ache that made every position unbearable. She could not sit for more than a few minutes without the pressure becoming intolerable. She slept on her stomach, or tried to, and woke up every hour or two with her teeth clenched and her hands balled into fists around whatever she was gripping. She had gone back to work after 3 days because she had no choice. There was no one to cover her shift and no savings deep enough to weather even a week without pay. And she sat at the telegraph desk on the edge of her stool with her weight shifted awkwardly forward, sweating through her collar even in the October chill, transcribing messages about ore shipments and land transfers and the price of beef while her body quietly tried to kill her. She had gone to see Dr. Haverford on the 5th day. His office was on the west end of Main Street, above the pharmacy. He had looked at her wounds with an expression she could not fully read, part professional assessment, part something more uncomfortable, something that wanted to be somewhere else. He had cleaned the wounds with carbolic solution, which had made her grip the edge of his examination table hard enough to leave marks, and he had wrapped them in fresh bandages, and he had told her to rest. "Dr. Haverford," she had said, "I need you to write down what you see. What caused these injuries?" He had been quiet for a moment. "Miss Whitlock," he had said finally, "rope burns of this nature can occur in a number of ways. A fall from a horse, if the foot catches in a stirrup— I was not on a horse— can produce significant trauma to the lower extremities." She had stared at him. He had not looked back at her. He had begun writing something in his patient ledger, his pen scratching carefully, his eyes fixed on the page. She had left without another word. The trouble with Redstone Crossing was not that it was a cruel town. That would have been easier to understand. The trouble was that it was a frightened one. Aldous Mercer had arrived in the territory 3 years ago with money from an Eastern Investors Consortium and a land claim that covered more acreage than most people could visualize. He had built the Redstone Mine, which employed 230 men at last count. He had built the company housing that half the town lived in. He had financed the road that connected Redstone Crossing to the main supply route north. He sat on the territorial land board. He had the ear of the county judge. He hosted dinners that the sheriff attended, and the sheriff's deputies attended, and the man who issued business licenses attended, and every merchant with a store on Main Street had, at one time or another, been extended credit by Aldous Mercer that they had not yet fully repaid. His son Gavin was 26 years old and had never, as far as anyone in Redstone Crossing could testify, been told no by anyone who mattered. Clara had made the mistake of telling him no herself, 3 weeks before the night of October 4th, when he had come into the telegraph office after hours with whiskey on his breath and an idea about how she might like to spend her evening. She had told him clearly and without apology to leave. He had looked at her with an expression she hadn't known how to read at the time. She understood it better now. The town had chosen silence. Not because they didn't know what had happened. She could see in their eyes that most of them knew or suspected or had heard enough to draw conclusions. But knowledge and action were two very different things when the man responsible had his father's name on half the buildings in town. Mrs. Aldridge at the boarding house where Clara rented a room had been kind enough, in a cautious sort of way. She had brought Clara soup twice and changed her bandages once without being asked. But she had also said very quietly on the third day, "Clara, you have to understand, my husband works at the mine." And Clara had understood. She had understood completely. The women at the dry goods store had stopped meeting her eyes when she came in to buy supplies. The men at the saloon went quiet when she walked past on the street. Deputy Crane had come by the telegraph office once, not to check on her but to remind her, with careful courtesy, that making unsubstantiated accusations against respectable citizens was a serious matter that could result in legal complications for the accuser. She had thanked him for stopping by. Then she had gone back to her telegraph desk and sat there, her ankles throbbing, and she had thought about what it meant to be 22 years old and injured and alone in a town that had decided, collectively, that she was less important than their own safety. By the 11th day, the fever had gotten bad enough that she was losing track of time. Thorne Callahan rode into Redstone Crossing on the morning of October 15th with 3 horses and enough pelts to suggest he'd had a good autumn in the high country. He was not a small man, and he was not a particularly tidy one. A season in the mountains had a way of stripping away anything unnecessary, including the performance of civilization. He wore a coat of elk hide over a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, and his face had the particular weathered quality of someone who spent more time above the tree line than below it. He was 34 years old and had been trapping and hunting in the Colorado Rockies for the better part of 12 years, with occasional descents into settlement life to trade, resupply, and remind himself why he preferred the mountains. He had no family he stayed in contact with, no permanent address, and no political opinions beyond a broad preference for people minding their own business and a narrower, stronger preference for people not hurting those who couldn't fight back. He had been to Redstone Crossing twice before, both times to sell furs to the trading post on the north end of town. He knew it as a busy, loud, rough-edged mining settlement with decent whiskey and a telegraph office that worked reliably, which was more than you could say for some towns. He had no reason to expect this visit to be different from the others. He noticed the telegraph office was open, but went to the trading post first to get his business done. Holt, the trader, was a practical man who paid fair prices and didn't ask too many questions. And within an hour, Thorne had traded his pelts, restocked his supplies, and concluded his transaction with the efficiency of a man who did not enjoy lingering in towns any longer than necessary. It was when he walked past the telegraph office on his way to get his horses from the livery that he slowed down. The door was propped open with a brick, which was unusual for October in the mountains. The air was cold enough that you didn't leave doors open for comfort. Through the doorway he could see a young woman at the desk, her back to him, working the telegraph keys. She was wearing a dark blue dress and had her hair pinned up, and at first glance there was nothing remarkable about the scene. Then she shifted in her seat. It was a small movement, involuntary, the kind of micro-adjustment someone makes when they're trying to find a position that hurts slightly less than the current one. He had seen that movement before. He had made it himself, once, after a rock fall in a narrow canyon had caught him sideways, and he'd spent 2 weeks in a trapper's cabin waiting to find out if his ribs would heal straight. He stopped. He looked at her more carefully. The back of her neck, below the pinned hair, was damp despite the cold. Her shoulders were held with a kind of deliberate tension that wasn't the tension of concentration. It was the tension of someone managing pain continuously, the way you braced yourself against something that never stopped. He looked at her feet. She was wearing low boots, and below the hem of her dress, where the boots ended, the skin was visible. What was visible was not right. The skin around her ankles had the color and texture of something that had been through a bad time and not come out clean. He stood in the doorway. "Ma'am," he said. She turned. Up close, the fever was obvious, a glassy sheen to her eyes, a flush along her cheekbones that had nothing to do with cold air or exertion. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had been approached by too many people recently who were not offering help. "Office is open," she said. "If you need to send a message, it's 30 cents for the first 10 words. I don't need to send a message right now." He stepped into the doorway, not inside, just enough to be out of the wind. "How long have you been running a fever?" Her expression shifted. Something complicated crossed her face, surprise, and then a wall going up behind the surprise. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not," he said. "I'm not trying to pry, but that," he nodded toward her ankles, "that looks like it's been infected for a while." She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked back at her telegraph machine. "The doctor says it's healing." "The doctor told you that?" He implied it. Thorne was quiet for a moment. "Can I come in?" "Are you a doctor?" "No." "Then I'm not sure what—" "I've treated infected wounds in the field for 12 years, he said, "mostly on myself. Once on a mule who bit me for the trouble, which I thought was ungrateful." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not, but I know what an infection looks like when it's getting better and when it isn't, and what you've got there isn't getting better." She looked at him again. He had the sense she was making some kind of calculation, not about whether to trust him, exactly, but about whether she had the energy left to keep refusing help from everyone who offered it. "There's a chair by the stove," she said finally. He came in and sat down. Her name was Clara Whitlock, and she told him almost nothing for the first 20 minutes. She kept working, kept sending and receiving messages, kept her hands busy, and answered his questions in short, deflecting sentences that were technically responsive without being informative. He asked how long she'd been at the job. Over a year. He asked if she'd grown up in the area. Not exactly. He asked if she had family nearby. The pause before she answered that one was longer than the others. "No," she said. He asked if he could look at her wounds properly. "You'd need to—" she started. "I've got clean cloth and carbolic in my pack, and I'm not going to report back to anyone. I don't know anyone in this town." Another long pause, then she nodded. What he found when he carefully unwrapped the bandaging was worse than he'd expected from the outside. The wounds were deep, not cuts exactly, but the kind of tearing and abrading that happened when something soft was dragged hard across something rough. The rope burns encircled both ankles completely, and the infection had gotten a firm hold. The skin around the edges was hot, tight, discolored in ways that made him concerned about what was underneath. He worked carefully and didn't rush it, and while he worked, he didn't ask her anything. He had found over the years that silence was often more useful than questions. People filled silence when they were ready to. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He said I fell from a horse." Thorne continued what he was doing. Who did? Deputy Crane, then the doctor, then… She stopped. Everyone. He looked up at her. These aren't injuries from a fall, he said. No, she said. They're not. He waited. She told him. Not all of it, not right away. It came out in pieces, the way things do when you've been holding them in a closed space for too long and the pressure finally finds a crack. The night of October 4th, Gavin Mercer behind the telegraph office. The rope. The trail. Waking up alone under the cold stars and dragging herself back toward the lights of town. Thorne kept working while she talked. He cleaned the wounds more thoroughly than they'd been cleaned before, applied carbolic acid with careful concentration, and began the work of wrapping them properly, with enough pressure to support the tissue, but not so much that circulation would be impaired. His hands were very steady. When she finished talking, the office was quiet except for the small sounds of the stove and the occasional sound of a horse or wagon outside on the street. 11 days, he said. Yes. And you've been working the whole time. I didn't have a choice. He tied off the bandaging and sat back. You said the doctor saw you. What did he write in his record? Nothing useful. He wrote that I presented with rope abrasions to the lower extremities, consistent with… Her voice went flat. Consistent with an equestrian accident. Did he examine the wounds carefully? He cleaned them. He looked at them. She paused. He knows what they are. He's not incompetent. He just… She stopped again. He's afraid of the Mercer family, Thorne said. Everyone is. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. Then he looked up at her. You said there was a rope. Yes. What happened to it? She blinked. I left it on the trail. I was trying to get back to town. I wasn't thinking about… It doesn't matter, he said. What color was it? She thought. Red. A dark red. Crimson. The kind of rawhide they use for decorative tack. I remember thinking that was strange, that someone would use decorative rope for… She stopped. Gavin Mercer, he said. Does he ride? He has horses, nice ones. His father buys him nice things. Thorne nodded slowly, as though he was filing that away. Then he turned back to her wound, and as he did, his eye caught something that had not been visible in the first examination. A small dark fragment embedded at the very edge of one of the deeper abraded sections, where the skin had partially closed around it as the tissue swelled. He leaned in closer. Hold still, he said. What is it? Something that got left behind. He used a small tool from his pack, the kind of instrument that served multiple purposes in the field and that he kept meticulously clean and worked with focused, careful attention. Claire's hand gripped the edge of the desk hard, but she didn't make a sound. What he extracted was small. A fragment of rawhide, dark crimson, embedded deep in the wound, a piece of whatever rope had been used, driven into the flesh by 11 days of pressure and movement and the body's attempt to wall it off. He held it up. Even at that size, the color was unmistakable, a very specific, expensive crimson dye, the kind of color that showed up on tack for horses belonging to men who wanted to demonstrate that they could afford to color their riding equipment. Clara stared at it. That, Thorne said quietly, was inside your body. Her face had gone very still. That's evidence, he said. If anyone were willing to, I'm willing to, he said. He went to find Dr. Haverford that afternoon. Clara had tried to dissuade him. She had been living with these people for over a year. She knew what they were capable of. She knew what Aldous Mercer's shadow felt like over a town, and how completely it covered everything. She had told him that going to the doctor would accomplish nothing except making their situation more dangerous. Thorne had listened to all of this. Then he had tied his horses to the post outside the telegraph office, asked her to lock the door from the inside until he got back, and walked to the west end of Main Street. Dr. Haverford's office was occupied. A patient was leaving as Thorne arrived. A miner, with a bandaged hand, who glanced at Thorne with the particular wariness that strangers got in tight-knit settlements. Thorne nodded at him. The miner moved on. The doctor was a thin man in his 50s, with the kind of face that had once been pleasant, and had since been rearranged by years of careful compromise. He looked up when Thorne came in and did a brief involuntary assessment, measuring the man in front of him the way people measured things they weren't sure about. "I don't have an appointment," Thorne said. "I won't take up much of your time. If you're ill, I can—" "I'm not ill." Thorne closed the door behind him. "I've been speaking with Clara Whitlock. I've examined her wounds." The doctor's expression didn't change visibly, but something behind it did. Miss Whitlock presented with injuries consistent with— "Don't," Thorne said. Not loudly, flatly. The doctor stopped. "I've been in the back country for 12 years, Thorne said. "I've seen men dragged by horses. I've seen men dragged by ropes. I know what each one looks like. And I know the difference. And so do you." He reached into his coat pocket and produced the small wrapped cloth that held the piece of crimson rawhide. He set it on the doctor's desk. "That came out of the wound on her right ankle. I extracted it an hour ago. It's been in there since the night it happened." The doctor looked at the cloth. He didn't touch it. "There's something you can do," Thorne said. "You can write down what you actually saw when you examined her. Not what you wrote in the record. What you saw." He paused. "A sworn statement. Notarized if there's a notary in this town, which I assume there is given the amount of land business happening. Mr. Callahan." "Mr. Callahan." The doctor's voice had taken on the particular cadence of a man choosing words very carefully. "You have to understand the situation in this town. The Mercer family has—" "I understand the situation," Thorne said. "I'm asking you to do the right thing anyway." Silence. "If I do this," the doctor said quietly, "I lose everything. My practice, my home. The Mercers will—" "If you don't do this," Thorne said, "I go to the territorial newspaper with what I've found, and I name you specifically as the physician who concealed evidence of a violent assault. You'll lose your license the slow way instead of the fast way, and you'll deserve it." He picked the cloth back up and put it in his pocket. "I'd rather you chose differently." Another silence, longer. The doctor looked at his desk, at his hands, at the diploma on the wall that had cost him 4 years in Philadelphia and represented the whole architecture of his professional life. "She could have died," Thorne said. Not as an accusation, as a fact. Something shifted in the doctor's face. "Yes," Haverford said very quietly. "She could have. Is she going to die? With proper treatment? The infection it's serious. But if it's treated properly now, she has a good chance." He paused. I should have been more aggressive with the treatment from the start." "You should have been more aggressive with a lot of things," Thorne said. He let that sit for a moment. "I'll come back for the statement in an hour," he said. "Have it written when I return." He was halfway back down the stairs when he heard the voices outside, the particular tone of men who wanted to be heard before they were seen. 2 of them, he estimated, walking with the unhurried confidence of people who believed they had authority. He came out onto the walkway and found Deputy Crane and another man he didn't know. Younger, wearing a badge that sat crooked on his coat, blocking the bottom of the steps. "You'd be the trapper," Crane said. "That would be me. Heard you've been asking questions around town." "Heard it from who?" Thorne stepped down to street level. He was taller than both of them by enough to matter. Crane's expression was practiced, the professional neutrality of a man who had made his choices long ago and had learned to live with them. "Redstone Crossing is a peaceful community, Mr. Callahan. We work hard to keep it that way. Sometimes outsiders come through and they don't fully understand how things work here." "I think I understand pretty well," Thorne said. "Miss Whitlock had an accident," the younger deputy said. He had the eager energy of someone who hadn't yet learned when to stay quiet. "No, she didn't," Thorne said. A pause. "That's a serious accusation," Crane said. "It's a statement of fact," Thorne said. "There's a distinction." He looked at Crane steadily. "I've sent a telegraph to the Territorial Marshal's office this morning, describing the situation in some detail. He had not done this yet, but he intended to the moment he got back to the office, and the information served its purpose now. I suspect they'll be sending someone. Could be a week, could be less, given the nature of what's been done here." He watched Crane absorb this. "If I were you," Thorne said, "I'd start thinking about what side of this I wanted to be standing on when those men arrived. Because the window for making that choice is closing." He looked at the younger deputy. Both of you. He walked away before either of them responded. By early evening, he had what he needed. The doctor's statement, 3 pages, written in the careful hand of a man who had weighed his soul against his safety and made a choice he would have to live with, was folded and sealed and in Thorne's coat pocket beside the piece of crimson rawhide. He had sat with Haverford while he wrote it, not because he didn't trust him, but because he wanted the man to understand that someone was watching, that this moment mattered, that the words going onto those pages were real. Haverford had aged visibly in the hour it took him to write it. When he finished and signed his name, he set down the pen and sat for a long moment without speaking. "She's going to remember this for the rest of her life," Haverford said, not looking up. "Yes," Thorne said. "She is. I'll remember it too." Thorne said nothing to that. He folded the pages and put them in his pocket. He went back to the telegraph office. Clara was still at her desk because there was nowhere else for her to be. And when he came in and told her about the statement and the evidence and the message he intended to send to the territorial marshal, she looked at him with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite disbelief. Something between them, fragile as a thing that has been broken before and is not fully certain it can survive being handled again. "They're going to come after you," she said. "Mercer will know by morning. Gavin—" "I know," he said. "Thorne." She said his name like she was testing its weight. "Why are you doing this?" He thought about it. He was not a man who answered quickly for the sake of answering. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because the only thing worse than what happened to you is a town full of people who know it happened and decided it was more convenient to pretend otherwise." He paused. "I've never been good at pretending." She looked at him for a long time. "What do we do now?" He pulled up the chair by the stove and sat down. "Send the telegraph first," he said. "Then I need to tell you what I'm thinking about doing next. And you need to tell me honestly whether you're strong enough for it." Outside, the sun was going down over the Rockies, painting the high peaks in shades of red and orange and a deep, cold purple. The town of Redstone Crossing went about its evening business. The saloon filling up, the mine shift changing, the lights coming on in the boarding houses and company housing, and the fine 2-story home at the north end of town where Aldous Mercer sat down to a good dinner and had no idea yet that the world he had built was beginning to crack at its foundations. Clara Whitlock sat at her telegraph desk with her hands on the keys and her ankles wrapped clean for the first time in 11 days, and she sent the most important message she had ever transmitted in her 14 months as an operator. Then she looked at Thorne Callahan and said, "Tell me the plan." The plan was not complicated. That was the thing about Thorne. He didn't build things with more moving parts than necessary. Complexity was a luxury for people who had time and safety and backup options. He had none of those things, and neither did Clara, and so what he laid out for her that evening was simple and direct and carried real risk in every step of it. "We leave tomorrow morning," he said, "before first light if possible. I have a cabin. It's not close, 2 days hard ride into the high country, but it's remote enough that no one who doesn't already know where it is will find it easily. You'll have time to heal properly, real time, not the kind where you're sitting at a telegraph desk trying not to pass out." Clara was quiet. Outside the window, Main Street had settled into its evening rhythms. The distant noise of the saloon, horses moving past, the creak of a wagon somewhere. Normal sounds, the sounds of a town that was deciding, hour by hour, how little it had to do with her. "What about the office?" she said. "The telegraph office?" "It's my job." He looked at her, not unkindly but directly. "Clara, you sent the message. Once the marshal's office receives it, and they will, the lines were good tonight, this situation is already in motion. Staying here doesn't protect the evidence. We have the evidence. Staying here just gives Gavin Mercer time to make both of us disappear before anyone official arrives." She knew he was right. She had known it before he finished the sentence, but there was something about saying it out loud. Leaving the job, leaving the room she'd rented, leaving the narrow life she'd built here piece by careful piece, that felt like giving up something she'd been holding on to too hard for too long. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, "I rent from her. I owe her for the rest of the month. Leave what you can. Write her a note if you want, but we can't spend more time here than we have to." She nodded slowly. "I'll need to gather some things," she said. "For my room. I'll come with you." "Thorne," she said it quietly, I've been managing on my own for 11 days. I know you have, he said. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying I'd rather not wait outside while you do. She studied him for a moment. There was something about the way he said things. No decoration, no softness to make them easier to swallow, but also no cruelty. Just the bare shape of what he meant. All right, she said. Mrs. Aldridge was in the kitchen when they came in through the back, which was the most direct route from the telegraph office. She was a broad woman in her late 40s with the particular efficiency of someone who had run a boarding house for a long time and had learned to read a room before she walked into it. She read this one in about 4 seconds. Her eyes moved from Clara to Thorne and back. You're leaving, she said. I have to, Clara said. Mrs. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. She wiped her hands on her apron, the automatic gesture of someone buying herself a moment to think. Is this? Are you safe? Where you're going? Safer than here. Another silence. Mrs. Aldridge looked at Thorne again, the measuring look of a woman who had seen a lot of men come through her house and had developed opinions about most of them. You're the trapper, she said. Came in this morning. Yes, ma'am. You're taking her somewhere. I am. And she's going willingly. Mrs. Aldridge, Clara said. He's the first person in 11 days who helped me without asking me to keep quiet about it afterward. Mrs. Aldridge pressed her lips together. It was a complicated expression, part guilt, part something older than guilt, something that had been living in her for 11 days alongside the soup she'd brought, and the bandages she'd changed, and the thing she hadn't done, which was speak. I'll give you back the rest of the month, she said abruptly, for the room. You don't have to. I know I don't. She moved to the counter, opened a tin, counted out bills with quick, precise fingers. She handed them to Clara without ceremony. Take the blanket off your bed, the heavy one. You'll need it up there. She glanced at the window, at the dark outside. The nights are cold now. Clara looked at the money in her hand. Then she looked at Mrs. Aldridge. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, nothing that neat, but something. Thank you, Clara said. Mrs. Aldridge nodded once. You be careful. They were out before the town was properly awake, moving through the pre-dawn dark with 3 horses, 2 of Thorne's and 1 he'd borrowed against promise of return from the livery owner, a transaction conducted at an hour early enough that no one with connections to the Mercers was likely to be watching. The air was sharp and thin, the stars still bright over the mountain ridges to the west, and Clara rode with her weight adjusted carefully, the fresh bandaging and a day's worth of better treatment making the pain something she could manage rather than something that was managing her. They rode in silence for the first hour. The trail out of Redstone Crossing headed north along the mining road before Thorne turned them west, onto a path that was less a path than a suggestion, a line through the scrub oak and aspen that you could follow if you knew where you were going and couldn't find it all if you didn't. How long have you been using this route? Clara asked, once the lights of town had disappeared completely behind the ridgeline. 7 years about, he said, longer going in the other direction. He glanced back at her. You're riding all right? I'm fine. You've said that before. This time I mean it a little more. He almost smiled. She saw it in profile, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth that didn't quite complete itself. It occurred to her that she didn't know much about him. She'd been so occupied with her own situation, with the evidence, with the plan, that she hadn't thought to ask the basic questions. Where he'd come from, how he'd ended up here, in the Rockies, living the way he lived. Where are you from originally? She said. A pause. Ohio. She waited. Long time ago, he added. What did you do in Ohio? Farmed, mostly, with my father. Another pause. That's also a long time ago. She understood enough to leave it there. Everyone who ended up at the edge of the frontier had left something behind. That was the nature of edges. They attracted people who needed distance from the middle. They rode through the early morning, the light coming up slow and gray over the eastern mountains, the aspens on the lower slopes going gold and red with October. It would have been beautiful under different circumstances. It was still beautiful, Clara realized, even under these ones. She hadn't noticed beauty in 11 days. The noticing felt like something returning. By mid-morning, they had gained enough elevation that the air had a real bite to it, and they stopped beside a creek to water the horses and eat something, dried meat and hardtack from Thorne's pack, Not pleasant, but sufficient. Clara sat on a flat rock with her boots off and her re-wrapped ankles in the cold air, which helped more than she'd expected. "Tell me about the cabin," she said. "It's not much," he said. "One room, stone fireplace, decent roof. I built it 6 years ago. Improved it some since then." He was checking the horse's feet while he talked, crouching down with the focused attention of someone for whom an unsound horse in the high country was a serious problem. "There's a spring nearby. Wood already cut and stacked for winter. I do that in August before the weather changes." He moved to the second horse. "It'll be cold at night, but you'll have the fire." "What about food?" "I have supplies, more than enough for a while." He looked up at her. "You worried about the practicalities?" "I'm a practical person," she said. "I noticed that." She picked up a small stone from the creek bank and turned it in her hands. "You live up there alone all winter?" "Most winters, yes." "Doesn't that get—" She stopped. "Lonely?" "I was going to say difficult. Sometimes," he said, "but I know what I'm doing up there. Down here—" He straightened up, looked back in the general direction of Redstone Crossing, invisible now behind several ridges. "Down here, I never quite know what I'm doing." "You seemed to know exactly what you were doing yesterday." "That was different," he said. That was a clear situation. Right thing was obvious," he paused. "Towns are harder. People are harder. There's always a dozen considerations I don't see coming." Clara set the stone down. "The doctor," she said. "Do you think he'll hold?" It was the thing she'd been turning over since they'd left. Haverford, with his 3-page statement and his sign name and his face that had aged a decade in an hour. She kept trying to assess what he'd do when the pressure came. And the pressure would come, probably sometime today, when Mercer's people figured out she was gone. Thorne was quiet for a moment. "He made his choice," he said. "He signed his name to it. Once a man does that, he usually sticks with it. Not because he wants to, but because going back on it makes him something worse than he already was. And most people can't tolerate that." "Most people," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Most." She put her boots back on. They were 2 hours from the cabin when they heard the riders behind them. Thorne heard them first. His ears had been tuned to the mountain long enough that he registered the distant sound before it resolved into anything identifiable. He held up his hand without looking back, and Clara pulled her horse up immediately, which told him something about her. She hadn't asked why, she'd just responded to the signal. That was the kind of practical intelligence that was easy to underestimate until you needed it. He listened. 2 horses. Maybe 3. Moving at a pace that was faster than casual but not quite urgent. The pace of men who were following a trail but weren't certain they were on the right one. "Deputies?" Clara said very quietly. "Could be." He turned his horse so he could look at the terrain behind them. The trail had come up through a narrow draw, and the draw bent back on itself enough that whoever was following them couldn't see them yet. Could also just be miners coming off shift heading to a claim. He paused. "But the timing's not great." "What do we do?" He looked up the slope to their left. There was a shelf of rock about 50 feet up, obscured by a stand of lodgepole pine, with good sight lines back down the draw. "We go up there. We wait and see who it is. If it's nobody, we move on. If it's somebody, I want to know before they know where we are. And if it's Mercer's men," he looked at her, "then we have a conversation about this mountain and who knows it better." They left the trail and picked their way up the slope carefully. Carefully because a shod horse on loose shale makes noise that carries in the mountains, and Thorne moved them slowly enough that the sound stayed minimal. He tied the horses in the pines, out of sightline from below, and he and Clara worked their way to the edge of the rock shelf. Below them, the draw came into view in both directions. They waited. The riders came around the bend 3 minutes later. 2 men, not in deputy uniforms, but in the particular kind of clothes that men wore when they wanted to look unremarkable and didn't quite succeed. 2 new, 2 matched, the gear of men who'd been equipped for a job. One of them had a rifle across his saddle. The other was scanning the hillsides with the deliberate attention of someone who was looking for tracks. "That's not a miner," Clara said, barely above a whisper. "No," Thorne agreed. He watched them work along the trail. The one scanning the hillside, the one with the rifle watching the higher ground. They were not amateurs, but they were also not from here. He could tell by the way they moved through the terrain. Functional but uncertain, relying on visual landmarks in a landscape where visual landmarks were less reliable than topography, where you navigated by understanding the shape of the mountain under you, rather than the features you could see. The trackers paused directly below the shelf. One of them said something to the other, too low to hear, and the other shook his head. Thorn had known men like this before. Men hired to do things that other men didn't want their names attached to. There was a flatness to the way they operated. Professional, without particular investment in the outcome. Not cruel for its own sake, but not restrained by much either. He did not like the idea of Clara being within reach of them. After a few minutes, they moved on. Not up the slope. They'd missed the point where he'd left the trail, which told him the tracker wasn't as experienced as he carried himself. They went deeper into the draw, following the trail's main line. He and Clara stayed on the shelf until the sound of the horses had faded completely. "They'll figure out they've lost it eventually," he said. "Come back and look more carefully." "How long do we have?" "Enough." He stood. "Let's move." The cabin came into view in the late afternoon when the light was going amber and the shadows were getting long across the high meadow. It sat in a shallow bowl just below the tree line, stone-built, low to the ground, with a roof that had been replaced not long ago and a lean-to on the east side for the horses. The meadow around it was browning with the season, but the spring Thorn had mentioned was still running clearly, and the woodpile stacked against the cabin's south wall was substantial. Clara looked at it for a moment without speaking. "I told you it wasn't much," Thorn said. "It's fine," she said. It's solid." She paused. "It looks like something that isn't going anywhere." "It isn't," he said. "I built it to stay." He helped her down from the horse. She managed most of it herself, but the last step from stirrup to ground jarred her ankles enough that she accepted the steadying hand without comment. He got the horses into the lean-to and saw to them while she stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked inside. The stone fireplace, the bunk built into the wall, the small table and 2 chairs, the shelves of supplies along the far wall. A window on the south side let in the last of the afternoon light. It was austere, but it was clean, and it was dry, and it was removed from every person and institution that had failed her for the past 11 days. She went inside and sat down in one of the chairs, very carefully, and put her hands flat on the table, and for a moment she just breathed. Thorn came in a few minutes later. He looked at her sitting there and didn't say anything. He went to the fireplace and began building a fire. It was October at elevation, and the temperature would drop sharply once the sun went below the ridgeline. While the fire was catching, he got water from the spring and put it on to heat. "I need to look at your wounds again," he said. "The riding today didn't help them." "I know. I want to make sure the infection isn't spreading." "I know that too." He sat down across from her and waited for the water to heat. The fire was starting to put real warmth into the room now, the stone walls absorbing it and holding it the way stone did. "Thorn," Claire said. "Yeah." "Those men behind us." She was looking at her hands on the table. "More are coming. You know that." "Yes. Gavin Mercer is not the kind of person who... He's going to be angry. Not just that I got away, but that you..." She stopped. "He's the kind of person who doesn't tolerate being made to look small. His father built everything here, and Gavin grew up thinking that means something, that it means he can do whatever he wants, and the consequences just..." She moved her hands. "Just don't apply." "That's a particular kind of dangerous," Thorn said. "Yes, but it's also a particular kind of stupid," he said. "People like that, they believe they control every situation because they've never been in one they couldn't buy their way out of. They come up into the mountains thinking it's the same as down in town, that whoever has the most money and the most men wins." He looked toward the window, at the high ridgeline going dark against the sky. "It's not the same up here." "You're very calm about this," she said. "I'm not calm," he said. "I'm just not panicking yet. There's a difference." He looked at her. "The water's ready. Let me see your ankles." She let him work. The wounds were inflamed from the riding. Not dangerously, but set back from where they'd been that morning. He cleaned them again, applied more carbolic, changed the dressing. His hands were matter-of-fact about it, professional in the way that came from years of field necessity rather than training. "You should have been a doctor," she said. "I thought about it once. he said, not looking up. Didn't have the patience for school. You have plenty of patience. For this, yeah. For sitting in a classroom being told things I could learn faster by doing them. He shook his head slightly. She watched him work. What happened in Ohio, she said. Not pushing, but just leaving the door open. A long pause. He tied off the new dressing before he answered. My father had a farm, he said. Good land, good soil. He worked it for 20 years. There was a man, neighbor, sort of, who wanted that land and found ways to make my father's life difficult until the debt got bad enough that he had to sell. He sat back. My father sold it for about a quarter of what it was worth and moved the family into town, and he spent the rest of his life being a different kind of man than he'd been before. He paused. Smaller, like something had gone out of him. Clara was quiet. I left when I was 19, he said. Came west. Kept going west until I found somewhere that felt like, I don't know, like the land wasn't owned by anyone who could take it from you. Is that what this is? She said. The mountain. Partly. He looked up at her. Partly it's just that I'm better at this than I am at most other things. Outside the cabin, the wind was picking up, the high-altitude sound of it moving through the pines, the familiar voice of the mountain settling into its evening. The fire had warmed the room properly now. Clara's fever was down. She could feel it, the absence of that particular heat behind her eyes, the return of a clarity she'd been missing for days. The federal marshal, she said. When do you think they'll send someone? Could be a week, Thorne said. Could be less if they take the telegraph seriously. Depends on who's on duty, how full their docket is. He paused. The message I sent was specific. I named Gavin Mercer directly. I referenced the doctor's statement. I mentioned the evidence. He looked at her. That's not the kind of thing they file and forget. It's the kind of thing they act on, if only to protect themselves from being accused later of ignoring it. And until then, he looked around the cabin, at the shelves of supplies, at the door with its solid bar, at the window that faced south toward the open meadow, where anything approaching from below would be visible long before it arrived. Until then, he said, we're in my world, and I know this mountain a hell of a lot better than any man Gavin Mercer could hire. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the fire. She was exhausted. Bone deep, soul deep. The accumulated exhaustion of 11 days of pain and fear and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people and having none of them see you. But she was also, for the first time since the night of October 4th, somewhere that felt like it might hold. She didn't trust easily. She had learned not to. But she had also learned, in 11 days of being failed by people who should have known better, to recognize the difference between someone who is performing safety and someone who is actually providing it. Thorne Callahan was not performing anything. She pulled the heavy blanket, Mrs. Aldridge's blanket, taken from her bed at the boarding house, around her shoulders and listened to the wind in the pines and the fire in the stone fireplace. And somewhere in the warmth and the exhaustion and the first real quiet she'd had in nearly 2 weeks, she slept. Thorne sat at the table for a long time after she did, the evidence wrapped carefully in oilcloth in his coat pocket, the doctor's statement folded beside it, and listened to the mountain, reading it the way he always had. For the sounds that didn't belong, for the shifts in the wind's direction, for whatever the high country was telling him about what was coming. It wasn't telling him anything good, but it was telling him the truth, and he had always preferred truth to comfort. He added a log to the fire and stayed awake. He found the first set of tracks on the morning of the third day. Thorne had been doing his early circuit, the habit of 12 years in the backcountry, checking the perimeter of the cabin's surrounding terrain before the light was fully up, reading the night's activity in the frost and mud the way other men read newspapers. Deer trail along the eastern ridge, fox working the meadow's edge. And then, half a mile down the main approach slope, the unmistakable impression of a man's boot in the soft earth beside a frost-edged creek crossing. Large boot, flat heel, not a riding boot, a working boot, the kind you wore when you expected to be on foot for a while. Beside it, the partial impression of a second boot, slightly smaller. He crouched over the tracks for a long moment without touching them. 2 men moving uphill on foot, which meant they'd left horses somewhere below. Horses made noise, and whoever these men were, they'd figured that much out. They were learning the mountain. Not fast enough, but learning. He followed the tracks 50 yards before he found where they'd stopped. They'd been watching the cabin. He could see where one man had crouched for a long time, the compressed earth, the small disturbance where he'd shifted his weight, with a clear sightline to the cabin's south-facing window. They knew where to come, which meant someone in Redstone Crossing had known enough about Thorne's route or his reputation to point men in the right direction. He thought about who that could be and came up with 2 or 3 candidates without much effort. The trading post owner, Holt, knew roughly where his cabin was. They'd discussed it once, years ago, in the context of Thorne's winter supply needs. It wouldn't have taken much pressure to get that information out of a man who had a business to protect. He went back to the cabin. Clara was awake, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she'd made herself, which he took as a good sign. 3 days ago, she hadn't had the energy to stand at the stove for that long. The fever had broken fully on the second day, and while the wounds were still healing, slowly, the way deep tissue damage healed, the infection had stopped advancing. She had color in her face again. She moved more carefully than a healthy person would, but she moved. "You found something," she said, reading his expression before he spoke. 2 men, on foot, been watching the cabin. She set her cup down. "How close?" "Close enough to see the window, far enough that they didn't come in last night." He pulled out a chair and sat. "They're scouting, figuring out the layout before they move." "How many do you think there are in total?" "Don't know yet." He looked at the window. "The 2 from the draw yesterday. If it was the same men, plus however many Gavin sent when he realized the first pair lost our trail. Could be 4, could be 6. He paused. "Gavin might be with them. That would be consistent with what you've told me about him, not the kind to stay home and wait." Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. "What do we do?" "We don't wait for them to come to us," he said. "That's the first thing. Inside this cabin, we've got 1 door and 2 windows, and they've got numbers. That's not a fight we want to have." He looked at her. "I know this mountain. They don't. That's the only real advantage we have, and I intend to use all of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to help." "I know. I'm not saying that to be brave. I'm saying it because sitting in this cabin waiting is... I can't do that. Not again." She met his eyes. "I've been sitting still and waiting for someone to help me for 11 days. I'm done with that." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Can you ride?" he said. "Not comfortably, but well enough to handle a horse on rough terrain?" "Yes." "All right." He stood. "Then here's what we're going to do." But the mountain was not just terrain to Thorne. It was a system. A network of pressure points and chokeholds and natural corridors that funneled movement in predictable ways whether you knew it or not. Men coming up from below had to cross the creek twice, pass through a narrow cut between 2 rock formations he'd privately named the gateposts, and then traverse a long open slope before they reached the tree line below the cabin's meadow. There was no other approach that didn't add 6 hours and a serious elevation gain. He'd built the cabin where he had partly because of this. He spent the morning setting up what he thought of as conversations. Not traps exactly, nothing designed to injure, but arrangements that would make the mountain speak to him before it spoke to the men coming up it. Trip lines of fine wire connected to clusters of dried branches that would rattle when disturbed. A loose arrangement of flat stones at the creek crossing that would slide audibly underfoot. At the gateposts, he wedged a series of dry limbs between the rock faces at knee height. Anyone moving through quickly in low light would hit them, and the sound would carry. Clara worked with him, doing what her ankles allowed. The detailed stationary work of stringing wire, of arranging stones, of the kind of patient, specific labor that required good hands and attention. She didn't complain. She didn't pretend she was fine when the terrain asked too much of her either. She simply redirected herself to what she could do without drama in either direction. He watched her while they worked and thought about what it took to be that practical under that kind of accumulated pressure. Most people in her situation would have spent this energy either falling apart or performing toughness. She was doing neither. She was just working. "You said your mother taught you to distrust smooth-talking men," he said, at one point, while they were rigging the second creek crossing. He'd remembered her mentioning it the first day in the telegraph office. She looked up. "Did I say that?" "More or less." She thought about it. She did. She had reason to. She pushed a stone into position. She was right, too. I just didn't always listen as well as I should have. Gavin Mercer seemed smooth talking to you initially? No, she said. He seemed loud and certain of himself, which is different. But by the time I understood what kind of certain he was, she stopped. He came into the office 3 or 4 times before that night, always friendly, always like it was a visit he was entitled to make. And you told him no once, and that was enough. Apparently. She stood up, tested her weight carefully. I've thought about it a lot. Whether I did something, said something that made it worse, whether I was... You didn't, Thorne said. You don't know that. I know enough, he said. Men like Gavin Mercer don't need a reason. They need an obstacle. You were an obstacle because you said no, and that was all. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in her expression that was complicated. Not quite relief because it was too early and the wound too recent for anything like relief, but a kind of recognition, like someone who had been turning a stone over and over in their hands, trying to find what was wrong with it, being shown that the stone was not the problem. My mother would have liked you, she said finally. She had no patience for men who talked around things. I'm not good at talking around things, he agreed. I've noticed. They went back to work. The first group came that afternoon. Thorne heard the gatepost limbs go at 2:30. The dry crack of wood carried clean on the still air, sharp enough to locate precisely. He and Clara were back at the cabin by then, and he was at the window facing south within seconds. 3 men, coming out of the tree line below the meadow, moving with the particular wariness of men who knew they'd made a sound and weren't sure what it had told. 2 of them had rifles out. The third, younger, moving with the aggressive impatience that Thorne had come to associate with people who were angry about something and not managing it well, was Gavin Mercer. He had not expected Gavin to be with the first group. He'd thought the man would stay behind the paid muscle, direct from a distance. But he was here, in person, which told Thorne something about the state of his thinking. This had become personal for Gavin in the way that only things touching pride could. Not just about the evidence anymore, not just the legal exposure. This was about the fact that a telegraph operator and a backcountry trapper had made him look small, and he could not tolerate that. Anger made men stupid. He filed that away. Stay back from the window, he said to Clara. Not against the walls, intipos, against the inner wall. The chimney stone. Is it him? She said. Yes. He heard her exhale. Not fear exactly. She'd known this was coming. But the particular quality of breath when something you've been dreading becomes real. Thorne left the cabin through the back, moving low and fast into the pines on the north side of the meadow. He'd prepared this too. A route that kept the cabin between him and the approaching men for the first 100 yards, then swung wide around the eastern edge of the meadow to higher ground. He got to the rock outcropping above and east of the cabin's position in under 4 minutes, settled in behind the granite, and had a full view of the meadow and the 3 men crossing it. He had a rifle. He had no intention of using it unless he had no other option, not because he was reluctant to use force in defense of his life or Clara's, but because a shooting, even a justified one, would complicate what was already a situation that needed to be resolved by law, not by him. The evidence and the doctor's statement were what mattered. The federal marshals were what mattered. What Thorne needed to do was delay, discourage, and preserve the situation until those men arrived. He let the 3 get to the middle of the meadow. Then he put a rifle shot into the ground 10 feet in front of them. The result was immediate and not dignified. 2 of the hired men dove sideways. Gavin stumbled backward and went down on one knee, which probably hurt, and scrambled behind the nearest cover, which was not much cover. "You're on my property," Thorne said from the rocks above. His voice carried easily. The acoustics of the mountain bowl worked in his favor. "I've got high ground, good cover, and I know every inch of this terrain. You've got none of those things. I'd suggest a conversation before anyone does something they can't take back." A silence. Then Gavin's voice, tight with the effort of sounding controlled. "Callahan, you've got something that belongs to us. Give it over and we walk away. Nothing up here belongs to you." "The woman," Gavin said, "and whatever she told you, whatever she gave you, you hand it over and this ends clean." From up in the rocks, Thorne looked at the man below. Gavin Mercer was 26 years old and had the particular brand of good looks that came from money and ease and a diet that didn't include much hardship. Even from this distance, even in this situation, there was an entitlement in the set of his shoulders that Thorne found remarkable. the bone-deep certainty that the world would ultimately arrange itself around his preferences. "Nothing's ending clean," Thorne said. "Federal marshals have already received a telegraph about what happened to Clara Whitlock. I sent it myself from Redstone Crossing 2 days ago. They've got the message, and they've got a sworn statement from the doctor describing the injuries he examined. You coming up here and shooting at me doesn't change any of that. All it does is add to it." Another silence. He could see Gavin conferring with the hired men. Quick, urgent conversation, the kind that happened when things weren't going the way they were supposed to. Then one of the hired men moved left, trying to work around toward the tree line, trying to get below Thorne's position and reduce the height advantage. Thorne had anticipated this. Before the man had gone 20 feet, his boot found the wire stretched between two lodgepole pines at ankle height, connected to a carefully balanced arrangement of deadfall that came down with a crash and a cloud of dust directly in his path. The man jumped back with a sound that was not composed. "I've got this slope set up in ways you're going to keep finding," Thorne said. "You can keep trying, or you can make a smarter decision." "You can't stay up there forever," Gavin called back. "I can stay up here longer than you can," Thorne said. "This is my mountain. You're a visitor." He watched Gavin's composure fracture at the edges. The man stood up from behind his cover, a calculated gesture of bravado that mostly just made him a better target, which told Thorne he was used to gestures landing differently. "My father has men coming," Gavin said. "More men than you can handle." "Your father's men are welcome to try the mountain," Thorne said. "So far today, I've seen 3 people come up it, and none of them have gotten further than the meadow." He watched Gavin stand there in the middle of the open meadow, his rifle at his side, his face doing something complicated. Thorne had seen this moment in other men. The moment when the gap between the way you believed the world worked and the way it actually worked became too wide to pretend to cross. The hired men were already moving back toward the tree line. They'd been paid for a job, not for a siege against a man who'd turned the terrain itself against them. Gavin stood alone for another moment. Then he followed. They came back that night. This time it was just one man, the better tracker, the one who'd been reading sign in the draw 2 days ago. He came up the west slope in full dark, moving slowly and carefully, clearly trying to locate the cabin's vulnerabilities without triggering whatever he'd been told waited on the main approach. Thorne found him by sound alone. The mountain at night was a different instrument than the mountain in daylight, quieter and more precise, and 12 years of listening to it had calibrated something in him that was hard to articulate but effective. He tracked the man for 40 minutes through the pine forest on the west side, letting him work his way toward the cabin, reading exactly where he was and what he was trying to do. What the man was trying to do was get close enough to the cabin to understand the layout, the window positions, the door, the distance to cover from various approach angles. He was good. In a different situation, Thorne might have respected the methodology. He stepped out of the trees 10 feet behind the man and said quietly, "Don't." The man froze. "Hands where I can see them." The hands went up, slow, deliberate, the practiced gesture of someone who'd been in this position before. "You've been tracking since the draw," Thorne said. "You're good at it. But I've been watching you for 40 minutes, which tells you something about the gap between your skill level and the situation you're in." The man said nothing. "What's your name?" "Doesn't matter." "No," Thorne agreed. "It doesn't." He kept his distance, close enough to control the situation, far enough to react if necessary. "How much did Mercer pay you?" A pause. "Enough." "Is it enough for a federal charge? Because what Gavin Mercer did to that woman is a federal matter now, and anyone who helps him obstruct it." Thorne left the sentence where it was. In the dark, he could see the man's shoulders drop slightly. Not surrender, just recalculation. "I was hired to find her," the man said. "That was the job." "And the men with you?" "Same." "Where's Gavin Mercer now?" A longer pause. "Lower camp, half-mile down the south approach. There's 5 of us total, including him." Thorne absorbed this. "You came up alone tonight." He wanted information before morning. "And the others?" "Waiting." Thorne was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines above them, the sound of it old and indifferent. "Here's what I'm going to tell you," he said. "The federal marshal's office received a telegraph from Redstone Crossing. They are sending men. My guess is 2 to 4 days from now, When those men arrive, they'll have questions for everyone who was on this mountain." He paused. A man who was hired to track someone and decided to walk away when he understood the full situation. That man's in a different position than a man who was still on the mountain trying to interfere with a federal investigation when the marshals showed up. The silence stretched. "I've got a horse tied on the West Ridge," the man said finally. "I know," Thorne said. "I found it an hour ago." Another silence. "It's still there," Thorne said. He listened to the man think. It didn't take long. "The others aren't going to like it," the man said. "That's between you and them," Thorne said. He stepped back into the trees and let the man go. He listened to the sound of his departure, moving faster now, toward the West Ridge, toward the horse. No hesitation, no circling back. One down. The next day was quieter, which Thorne didn't entirely trust. Quiet on the mountain often meant something was organizing itself out of sight. He kept Clara inside except for necessary movement, ran his circuits early and late, and watched the sight lines with the sustained attention of a man who had learned that patience was not the same as passivity. Clara, for her part, had found a kind of equilibrium that he wouldn't have predicted 3 days ago. The fever was gone, the wounds were knitting, not healed, not close to healed, but stable, moving in the right direction. And she had the particular quality of alertness that came from a body that had stopped spending all its resources just trying to survive and had some left over for the world. She read from a small collection of books he kept on the cabin shelf. Practical things mostly. A surveying manual, a trapper's almanac, one novel that a passing traveler had left 2 winters ago and that he'd read twice himself. She helped him prepare food, within the limits of what her ankles allowed her to do standing. She asked him questions about the mountain. What grew where, what the different sounds meant, why the wind shifted the way it did in the afternoon. He answered. He was not, as a rule, a man who talked a great deal, but her questions were specific and practical, and he found them easy to respond to. There was no performance in them. She wasn't asking to fill silence or to appear interested. She was building information because information was useful. On the afternoon of the 4th day, she said without preamble, "My father used to say that you could tell a man's character by what he did when nobody was watching." Thorne was checking the condition of the horses in the lean-to. He kept working. "Your father sounds like he had sense." "He did," she said. She was sitting on the lean-to's low bench in the thin afternoon sun. He also used to say it took a particular kind of courage to do the right thing when doing it cost you something. He straightened up and looked at her. "I don't think of myself as particularly courageous," he said. "I didn't say you did." She was looking at the high ridgeline, the peaks going white now with the first early snowfall above 12,000 feet. "I've been thinking about why you helped me. You didn't know me. You could have ridden out of Redstone Crossing and been 100 miles away and never thought about it again." "I saw what I saw," he said. "A lot of people saw what they saw," she said. He was quiet. "I think," she said, "that what you did is rarer than you know. I think most people understand what the right thing is and find reasons not to do it. And I think you're built differently than that." She looked at him. "I don't know how to thank you for it. I'm not sure there's a way to." He looked back at her steadily. "You don't need to thank me." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." He didn't have an answer for that. He went back to checking the horses, and she went back to watching the ridgeline, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the meadow below them, and the mountain went about its business in the quiet, enormous way mountains did. Gavin came back on the 5th day with the remaining 3 hired men, and he came back furious. Thorne saw them from the high eastern outcropping. He'd been up there since before first light, wrapped in a heavy blanket, watching the lower slopes. They came up the south approach in a group, not even trying for subtlety now, which told him that the patience had run out down there. Gavin was in front, which confirmed everything Thorne had concluded about the man's judgment. He let them reach the meadow, let them get to the same point where the rifle shot had stopped them 2 days ago. This time he didn't wait for them to settle. "Gavin!" he called down. Gavin stopped. He looked up at the rocks, and even from the distance Thorne could see the tightness in him. The jaw, the shoulders. "The tracker you sent up 2 nights ago left," Thorne said. He understood the situation. "The other 2 men you had originally, they haven't come back either. You're running out of people who want to be on this mountain with you." I've got 3 men right here, Gavin called back. You do, Thorn agreed, and I've got this slope rigged from the creek to the tree line, and I've had 5 days to improve it. He paused. Send them up if you want. I'll be interested to see what happens. One of the hired men said something to Gavin, low enough that Thorn couldn't hear it. Gavin's response was sharp and short. The man stepped back. Callahan, Gavin said. His voice had changed. The bravado was still there, but underneath it was something rawer. Whatever she told you, whatever you think happened, you don't understand this situation. Tell me how I'm wrong. She made a mistake. She said things she shouldn't have said. He stopped. Something happened in his face that he couldn't quite control. A flicker of something that might have been the beginning of an honest accounting, or might have just been fear of consequence dressed up as remorse. This doesn't have to go the way it's going. It already has, Thorn said. The moment you did what you did to her, this became the way it was going. Everything since then has just been the consequence catching up. A long silence. Your father can't buy this mountain, Thorn said, and he can't buy what's already in the hands of the federal marshal's office. He paused. Go home, Gavin, while you still can do it of your own choosing rather than in custody. He watched Gavin Mercer stand in the middle of the mountain meadow, 3 hired men behind him who were visibly reconsidering their life decisions. The high Rockies, indifferent and enormous in every direction, and he watched the thing that Gavin was finally beginning to understand settle over him like the first cold of winter. The hired men turned and walked back toward the tree line, all 3 of them, without a word to Gavin, without a backward look, just the quiet, pragmatic departure of men who had done the math and found the sum wanting. Gavin stood alone in the meadow for a long time. Then he turned and went after them. Thorn came down from the rocks and went back to the cabin. Clara was at the window, watching. They're gone, she said. For now, he said. He'll be back. He looked at her. But not with those men, and not the same way. He set his rifle against the wall. He's running out of options, and we're running out of time before he finds a new one. Yeah, he said. We are. He sat down and thought about Gavin Mercer standing alone in the meadow after his hired men left him. And he thought about the particular kind of desperate that a man became when he finally understood that the thing he'd believed was protecting him. His father's money, his father's name, the fear he'd cultivated in an entire town. None of it worked up here. None of it meant anything to the mountain. Desperate men made moves they couldn't take back. He needed to be ready for that. He came back alone. That was what Thorn hadn't fully anticipated. Not the return itself, which he'd expected, but the alone part. He'd imagined Gavin scraping together more men, making more noise, throwing more resources at a problem that resources couldn't solve. He hadn't imagined this. A single figure moving up the south approach in the gray pre-dawn light of the 6th day. No rifle visible, moving with the particular quality of someone who had run out of other ideas. Thorn saw him from the eastern outcropping and watched for a long time to make sure he was actually alone. 20 minutes of watching, patient and still, reading the slopes below for any secondary movement. Nothing. Just Gavin Mercer, climbing the mountain by himself in the cold morning dark, which was either the bravest or the most desperate thing Thorn had seen all week, and he wasn't yet certain which. He came down from the rocks and cut across the slope to intercept him before he reached the meadow. He stepped out of the tree line when Gavin was 30 feet away, and Gavin stopped. They stood looking at each other in the early gray light. Gavin's face was different than it had been 2 days ago in the meadow. Something had gone out of it. Not the arrogance exactly, that seemed structural, built into the bone. But the performance of certainty was gone. What was underneath it was younger and worse. I came alone, Gavin said. I can see that. I want to talk. You've been wanting to talk for 3 days, Thorn said. Start talking. Gavin looked around at the mountain, at the pines, the rock, the high ridgeline catching the first cold light. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life in rooms where he knew the rules and was now standing somewhere that had none of the rules he knew. The marshals, he said. Are they really coming? Yes. How long? Could be today, Thorn said. Could be tomorrow. I don't know their exact schedule. Gavin's jaw worked. My father. If he knew I was up here. He stopped. Does he know? No. Something in how he said it was revealing. Not shame exactly. More like the practiced deflection of a man who had spent his life operating just outside his father's full knowledge of things. He thinks I'm handling it. Are you handling it? A long pause. The wind moved through the pines above them, and the mountain was quiet in the particular way it got before the light fully came. She said no, Gavin said. It came out almost involuntarily, like something that had been under pressure for a long time. She said no, and He stopped again. And you decided that didn't apply to you, Thorne said. Gavin didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Here's what I want to know, Thorne said. The men you sent after us, were they instructed to bring her back or to make sure she didn't come back? The silence was long enough to be informative. Bring her back, Gavin said finally. That was the instruction. And the evidence? Destroy it. Thorne looked at him steadily. So not just assault, obstruction, intimidation, conspiracy. He let each word land. Your father's lawyers are going to have a full schedule. Gavin's face tightened. My father doesn't know. Your father built a situation where you believed you could do anything without consequence, Thorne said. Whether he knows the specifics of this particular night doesn't change what he built. He paused. But that's between him and the federal investigators, not my concern. What is your concern? Thorne looked at him for a moment. Right now, making sure you don't do anything else stupid before the marshals get here. Something shifted in Gavin's face. Something complicated. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or might have just been the expression of a man who had finally hit the limit of the world his father had built for him and was standing at the edge of it. Gavin started, stopped, started again. If I went back to town, waited. Waited for what? For the marshals, instead of, he gestured vaguely at the mountain, at the whole last week. Thorne looked at him for a long moment. He thought about Clara in the cabin, about her ankles, about 11 days of fever and pain, and a town full of people who'd looked away. He thought about the piece of crimson rawhide he'd extracted from her flesh. He thought about Mrs. Aldridge with her careful apron and her returned money, about Dr. Haverford aging a decade in an hour, over a pen and 3 pages of truth. You go back to town and you stay there, Thorne said. You don't touch anyone else who's connected to this. You don't go near the telegraph office. You don't go near Haverford. You don't make any more moves. He paused. The evidence is already where it needs to be. You can't undo what's been sent. All you can do now is choose how you meet what's coming. And you won't. I'm not a lawman, Thorne said. I'm not here to chase you. I'm here to make sure Clara Whitlock is safe and that the evidence reaches the right people. Both of those things are already done. He looked at Gavin steadily. Go back to town. Gavin Mercer stood on the mountain slope in the early morning light and looked like every decision he'd ever made was settling onto him at once. Then he turned and started back down. Thorne watched him go until the trees swallowed him. Then he stood for a moment in the cold and the quiet, listening to the mountain, and went back to the cabin. Clara was awake when he came in. She'd heard the voices, muffled through the cabin walls, not distinct enough to follow, but enough to know something had happened. Gavin, she said. Gavin, he confirmed. He sat down and told her what had passed between them, without embellishment. She listened with her hands flat on the table, the way she did when she was processing something difficult. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You let him go, she said. I told him to go back to town. That's not the same as him actually going. No, Thorne agreed. It's not. He looked at her. But a man alone, on foot, with no hired backup, and the federal marshals 2 days out, his options are limited. He can go back to Redstone Crossing and face it, or he can run. And running makes it worse. He paused. I think he's going to go back. Why? Because his father is there, Thorne said. Whatever else is true about Gavin Mercer, he spent his whole life with his father between him and consequences. Even now, even in this, I think he's going back to stand behind Aldous and hope the old man can fix it. Clara looked at her hands. Can he? Fix it? No, Thorne said. Not this time. Chet. The federal marshals arrived on the afternoon of the seventh day. Thorne saw them from the eastern outcropping, 3 riders on the main trail below, moving with the deliberate pace of men who were following directions and not in a hurry because they had authority, and authority didn't need to hurry. 2 of them were in the gray coats of federal deputies. The third was older, heavier, and rode with the particular ease of a man who had been doing this long enough that it had become simply the way he moved through the world. He went down to meet them at the gatepost, stepping out of the trees before they reached the rigged section of trail. "Marshal Thorne Callahan," the older man called. "Just Callahan," Thorne said. "Thorne Callahan. You're the marshal?" "Deputy Marshal Ellison Hayes, out of the Denver office." The man swung down from his horse with the slight stiffness of a long ride and extended his hand. "We got your telegraph. Took us longer than I'd have liked. The office had a backlog, and then we had weather on the pass." He looked Thorne over with the assessment of a man who made quick judgments professionally. "The woman, Miss Whitlock, she's here?" "She is. She's well. Better than she was." He paused. "I have the physical evidence and the doctor's sworn statement, both preserved." Hayes nodded. "And the suspect? Gavin Mercer?" "He was on this mountain 6 days ago with hired men. He came back alone yesterday morning. I told him to return to town." Thorne looked at the marshal steadily. "I'd recommend sending one of your men down to Redstone Crossing ahead of us to confirm his whereabouts before we bring Miss Whitlock back." Hayes studied him. "You let him walk." "I'm not a lawman," Thorne said. "My job was keeping her safe and getting the evidence to you. That's what I did." "A beat." Hayes almost smiled. "Fair enough?" He turned to one of the deputies. "Rourke, ride down to Redstone Crossing. Find out where Gavin Mercer is. Don't approach him. Send word back up." The deputy rode. Hayes looked back at Thorne. "Take me up to the cabin, Bub." The marshal sat with Clara for 2 hours. Thorne stayed outside during most of it, not because he was asked to leave, but because he understood that this was her testimony, her account, and she needed the space to give it on her own terms without him in the room as a reference point. He sat on the lean-to bench in the afternoon sun and listened to the mountain and to the low sound of voices from inside. Clara's voice steady and even, Hayes's voice asking questions with the practiced neutrality of a man who had heard a great many things and learned to take them in without visible reaction. When it was done, Hayes came out and stood beside Thorne for a moment without speaking, looking at the high ridgeline. "She's clear," he said finally. "The account is consistent, detailed, and coherent. Combined with the physical evidence and the doctor's statement." He shook his head slightly. "This is not a complicated case. It's a case that was made complicated by the people who were supposed to prevent that." "The sheriff's deputies," Thorne said. "Crane specifically," Hayes said. "We'll be talking to him." He looked at Thorne. "And the doctor, Haverford." "He wrote the statement voluntarily," Thorne said. "Under pressure, but voluntarily. He's cooperating. Cooperating after concealing evidence of a violent assault for 11 days. "Yes," Thorne said. "That's accurate." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Aldous Mercer. I don't know what he knew specifically," Thorne said, "but I know what he built. I know the kind of town that resulted from what he built." "That's a harder case to make," Hayes said. "Legally," he looked at Thorne, "but not impossible." He straightened up. "Word from Rourke came back while you were inside. Gavin Mercer's at his father's house. He's been there since yesterday evening." "He went back," Thorne said. "He went back." Hayes picked up his hat from the bench. "We'll be going down to collect him tomorrow morning. Tonight I want to go through the evidence with you properly. I want every detail of what you extracted, when, how, the chain of custody." "However long it takes," Thorne said. They went down the mountain the following morning, Thorne, Clara, Marshal Hayes, and his remaining deputy. The trail felt different going down than it had going up a week ago. The urgency had changed in quality, not the urgency of flight, but of arrival, of something finally reaching its end. Clara rode without difficulty. Her ankles were healing in the way deep wounds healed. Not quickly, not smoothly, with occasional days that were worse than the days before them, but overall in the right direction. She sat her horse with the careful competence of someone who had learned to manage her body's limitations without either surrendering to them or pretending they didn't exist. Halfway down, she pulled her horse alongside Thorne's. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm usually quiet." "Quieter than usual." He glanced at her. "Thinking about what happens when we get down there." Thinking about it badly or just thinking about it? Just thinking. He looked at the trail ahead. I don't spend much time in towns, and this particular town, he paused. It's going to be strange. People who looked the other way having to face what they looked away from. That's not comfortable for anyone involved. No, she said. It's not. She was quiet for a moment. I've thought about what I want from it, from going back. What do you want? I want it on record, she said. I want what he did written down in official documents that don't disappear. I want the people who said I fell from a horse to know that there are papers in a federal office somewhere that say exactly what happened. She paused. I don't need them to apologize. I'm not sure an apology would mean anything, but I want the truth to be the official version, not their version. It will be, Thorne said. I know. She looked at him. Because you made sure of it. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at the trail. Redstone Crossing was not prepared for what arrived that afternoon. The sight of federal deputies riding down Main Street had a particular effect on a town that had spent a week convincing itself that the situation was contained, that the telegraph operator was gone, that whatever she'd said had gone with her, that the Mercer family's influence would smooth things over the way it always had. The containment theory collapsed the moment Marshal Hayes's gray coat became visible at the north end of Main Street. Thorne rode beside Clara and watched the town react. Faces appearing in windows. Men on the walkway stopping mid-conversation. The particular ripple of information moving fast through a small settlement. Not surprise exactly, but the thing that came after surprise, when the thing you'd been avoiding finally arrived, and the relief of dread resolving into reality mixed badly with the shame of knowing why you'd been dreading it. Deputy Crane was the first one Hayes went to see. Thorne and Clara stayed back. Clara at Hayes's firm instruction, which she accepted with the equanimity of someone who had decided to trust the process she'd set in motion. Through the window of the sheriff's office, they could see Hayes at the desk, his posture calm and settled. Crane's posture increasingly not those things. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. When Hayes came out, Crane's badge was on the desk behind him. Suspended pending investigation, Hayes said, to no one in particular. The other deputy as well. He looked at Clara. You'll need to give your testimony formally, before a notary. We'll do that this afternoon, at the land office. That's the only notary in town. I'm ready, she said. Dr. Haverford came to find them before Hayes went to find him. He arrived at the land office looking like a man who had been preparing for this moment and was still not prepared for it, which was probably the honest version of what preparation looked like. He had his written statement with him, the original, which he handed to Hayes with both hands. He looked at Clara. Miss Whitlock, he said. She looked at him. I should have, he started. Stopped. Started differently. What I did, what I failed to do, I have no excuse for it. Clara was quiet for a moment. Thorne watched her face, the calculation happening in it. What this was worth, what it cost her, what she wanted to do with it. No, she said finally. You don't. She paused. But you wrote the statement. You signed your name to it. That mattered. A beat. It doesn't fix what you failed to do, but it mattered. Haverford nodded. It was not absolution, and he knew it wasn't. And the fact that he knew told Thorne something about the man that wasn't entirely damning. Joanne. They arrested Gavin Mercer at his father's house at 4 in the afternoon. Thorne was not there for it. He had no desire to be. He had done his part of this, the tracking, the preservation, the mountain, and the arrest was the law's work, not his. He heard about it afterward from Hayes, in the practical shorthand of a man summarizing an event without unnecessary color. Gavin had been in the parlor. He had not run. He had said nothing when the deputies put the restraints on him. Aldous Mercer had been present, and Aldous Mercer had, according to Hayes, gone very still in the particular way of powerful men who suddenly understood that the architecture they'd built their lives on had cracked somewhere foundational. He tried to intercede, Hayes said, called for his lawyer, talked about his standing with the Territorial Land Board. He paused. It didn't change anything. It never really was going to, Thorne said. No, Hayes agreed, but men like that always think it will. He looked at Thorne across the table of the small room they'd taken at the boarding house, Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, which had a particular irony that no one mentioned. The investigation into Aldous Mercer's business dealings will take longer. That's a different kind of case. But the men at the Territorial Land Board are already having uncomfortable conversations, from what I understand. Things have a way of unraveling once the first thread is pulled. Outside, the sun was going down over the Rockies, the high peaks catching the last red light, the shadows of the mountains long and cold over the town below. Thorne looked at it and thought about how different this place looked from up there, how small and particular and temporary the town seemed from the mountain, how the mountain itself was unchanged by any of this, by Gavin Mercer or Aldous Mercer, or the telegraph or the arrest or any of it. Clara came in from the adjacent room where she had been resting after the formal testimony. She sat down at the table across from Hayes, and there was something in how she moved that was different from the woman Thorne had found in the telegraph office 9 days ago. Not unrecognizable, but changed. The fever was gone, and with it something that had been covering something else, and what was underneath was steadier than he'd expected. "What happens next?" she said to Hayes. "With the case. Gavin Mercer will be transferred to Denver for trial. The evidence is strong. The physical evidence, the doctor's statement, your testimony, the testimony of the men he hired." Hayes folded his hands on the table. "There will be a trial. It will take time. You'll be asked to testify again." "I'll testify." "It won't be pleasant." "I know what unpleasant looks like," she said. "I've had a pretty thorough demonstration recently." Hayes almost smiled. "The doctor will lose his license. Crane and the other deputy will face charges of their own. Obstruction, dereliction of duty at minimum." He paused. "The town will have to live with this. Some of them, the ones who actively participated in the cover-up, will face legal consequences. Others will just have to live with what they know about themselves." He looked at her. "That's sometimes the harder one." Clara looked at the window at the last light on the peaks. "Yes," she said. "I imagine it is." After Hayes left, Thorne and Clara sat for a while in the quiet of the room. The boarding house was subdued around them. No normal house sounds, no cheerful noise from the kitchen. Mrs. Aldridge had fed them dinner without ceremony and retreated, and the house had the particular quality of a place sitting with something it needed to digest. "How are your ankles?" Thorne said. "Sore," she said. "The ride down didn't help." "Hayes said you could stay in town for a week or two before you'd need to travel to Denver for the preliminary proceedings. Give them time to heal more." "Yes," she said. She was looking at the table. "He said that." A pause. "What do you want to do?" Thorne said. She looked up at him. The question was simple and direct, and he'd asked it the same way he asked everything, without decoration, without anticipation in his face about what the answer should be. Just the question, offered plainly. "I don't want to stay here," she said. "This town—" She looked at the window. "I'll come back when I need to, for the testimony, for whatever the legal process requires." She paused. "But I don't want to stay here." "All right," he said. "The cabin," she said. "If I—" She stopped, looked at her hands, started more carefully. "You said winter was coming. You said you spend most winters up there alone." "I do." "Would it—" She looked up at him. "Would it be terrible if you didn't, this year?" He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, more like the quiet of a man making sure he understood exactly what was being said before he responded to it. "No," he said. "It wouldn't be terrible." She nodded, looked at the window again. The last light was gone from the peaks now, and the sky above the mountains was going deep blue and then darker, the first stars coming out over the ridgeline. "I've never lived somewhere that wasn't a town," she said. "I don't know if I know how." "It's not complicated," he said. "It's just different." "Will you show me?" He looked at her across the table, at the woman who had sat at a telegraph desk for 11 days in fever and pain because she had no other choice, who had told him the truth, when telling the truth had cost everyone else in town too much, who had worked a mountain slope with rope and wire while her body healed because sitting still waiting for rescue was something she was done with. "Yeah," he said. "I'll show you." Outside, Redstone Crossing went about the business of a town that had just had its comfortable silence broken open. The saloon was quieter than usual. Lights burned late in the Mercer house at the north end of town, where Aldous Mercer sat in his study with his lawyers and began to understand that the architecture of his life had developed a crack that no amount of money was going to seal. The telegraph office on the east end of Main Street sat dark and locked, its operator gone, its keys still. The truth had a way of doing that, of making very loud rooms go quiet when it finally arrived. What happened in those rooms afterward depended entirely on what kind of people were in them. Thorne knew what kind of person was sitting across the table from him. He had known since the first day, when she had told him the truth about what had been done to her, clearly and without performance, and had not asked him for a single thing except to listen. He had listened. That, it turned out, had been enough to change everything. They left Redstone Crossing on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after they'd come down from the mountain. 9 days was long enough for the formal testimony to be completed, for the notarized documents to be filed, for Marshal Hayes to confirm that Gavin Mercer was in federal custody in Denver and that the preliminary proceedings were scheduled for the following month. Long enough for Dr. Haverford to receive official notification that his license was under review pending the outcome of the obstruction inquiry. Long enough for Deputy Crane to be formally removed from his position and for the Territorial Land Board to quietly distance itself from Aldous Mercer in the particular way that powerful institutions distance themselves from men who had become liabilities. Not with apology, not with admission, but with a sudden collective amnesia about how closely associated they had ever been. 9 days was also long enough for Clara to understand that she had no reason to stay. The town had not apologized. She had not expected it to. What it had done, collectively, was something harder to name. A kind of chastened withdrawal, the behavior of a community that knew it had been seen doing something it couldn't be proud of, and was now waiting to see if the person who'd seen it would make a point of it. Faces on Main Street were careful around her. Voices were quiet. The women at the dry goods store served her without meeting her eyes, and the men at the livery were efficient and said nothing beyond what the transaction required. She found she didn't need anything from them. That was the thing she hadn't fully understood until she was standing in it. That the acknowledgement she'd wanted, the official record, the truth as the documented version rather than the convenient version, had come through the federal process and not through the town's conscience. And that was fine. Justice and forgiveness were different things, and she'd only asked for one of them. Mrs. Aldridge came to the door of the boarding house the morning they were leaving and stood on the step with her hands in her apron in the way she always stood when she was trying to say something that didn't come easily. "I want you to know," Mrs. Aldridge said, "what I did, what I didn't do. I think about it." Clara looked at her. The woman's face was not asking for anything. Not forgiveness, not the relief of being told it was all right. She was just stating a fact, and there was something honest in that which was more than Clara had gotten from most people in this town. "I know you do," Clara said. "That probably doesn't help much." "No," Clara said, "but it's something." She shook the woman's hand. It was not warm exactly, but it was real, and real was what she had. She went to her horse. Thorne was already mounted, their packs tied, the third horse loaded with supplies for the winter, so it's more than he'd carried up alone, because 2 people needed more than one, a practical reality he had adjusted for without comment. He looked at her when she came out, the same direct look he always gave her, checking her without making it a performance of checking her. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They rode north out of Redstone Crossing without looking back. Clara looked back once, not at the town exactly, but at the telegraph office on the east end of Main Street, the narrow building wedged between the feed store and the land broker's office with its always fresh paint. The door was locked. The brick that had propped it open on the day Thorne had first walked past was still sitting on the walkway beside it. She turned back to the trail and rode. The mountains were different in November than they had been in October. The aspens had finished their color and gone bare, the white trunks standing in groves like something assembled deliberately against the darker background of pine and fir. Snow had come to the high elevations, real snow now, not the early dustings on the peaks, but accumulated snow that changed the landscape's acoustics and made the mountain quieter in ways she was still learning to read. The meadow around the cabin had gone white and stayed white. The spring was still running, barely, threading dark water through the frost at its edges. She had been living at the cabin for 3 weeks when she realized she had stopped measuring time by the telegraph schedule. For 14 months in Redstone Crossing, her days had been organized around transmission windows and shift hours, and the particular rhythms of a communication system that treated time as a series of slots to be filled with information. She had woken knowing what hour it was, dressed for the office, timed her meals around her duties. The structure had been its own kind of anchor, reliable even when everything else wasn't. Up here, time moved differently. It moved by light and weather and the things that needed doing. The wood that needed splitting before the storm came in from the northwest, the horses that needed feeding at consistent intervals, the fire that needed managing through the night. She had not thought she would adapt to that rhythm easily. She was adapting to it. "You're less restless than you were a week ago," Thorne said one evening, from across the table where he was working on a piece of equipment, a trap mechanism that needed repairing, his hands moving through the task with the automatic competence of someone who had done it hundreds of times. "Is that an observation or a complaint?" "Observation." He glanced up. "You used to sit down and then get back up again, 3 times in an evening sometimes." She thought about it. "I think I was waiting for something to happen that I needed to be ready for. And now?" She looked at the fire. "Now I think whatever happens, I'll deal with it when it happens. I don't need to be braced for it constantly." He went back to his work. She went back to the book she was reading. A different one than the first time, an actual novel this time, something a supply rider had brought up from the Valley Trading Post along with their flour and dried beans. A story about people in a different kind of difficult landscape doing the complicated work of living in it. The quiet between them was the comfortable kind. Not the quiet of 2 people who had nothing to say to each other, but the quiet of 2 people who had said enough of the important things that silence didn't feel like a gap anymore. She had learned things about him in 3 weeks that she hadn't known in the first week on the mountain. Small things, mostly. The way he always checked the horses before he checked anything else in the morning, not from anxiety, but from a genuine prioritization of their well-being. The way he made coffee too strong by any reasonable standard and seemed entirely unaware of this. The way he laughed, which was rare and when it came was completely unguarded, nothing calculated in it, a real sound from a real place. The way he slept lightly. She heard him get up twice some nights to check the perimeter. Old habit, the mountain reflex that never fully turned off. She had also learned the things that were harder. The Ohio story was not finished. There were pieces of it she hadn't heard yet, pieces that came out in fragments when the fire was low and the night was quiet enough that things surfaced that usually stayed under. His father had not recovered from losing the land. That much she knew. She suspected there was more and did not push for it, because she understood what it was to have things that needed to come out in their own time at their own temperature. One night he asked her about her mother. "She died when I was 16, Clara said. Fever, winter." She paused. "She was a practical woman. Not cold, practical. There's a difference. She cried exactly once in front of me that I saw, and it was the night my father died, and then she dried her eyes and organized the funeral and made sure I had what I needed for the next school term." "You're like her," Thorne said. "People tell me that." She looked at the fire. "I used to not know if that was a compliment. What do you think now?" "I think—" She paused. "I think being practical is what lets you survive things. But surviving things isn't the same as living well. My mother survived everything that came at her. I'm not sure she was ever quite—" She stopped, feeling for the right word. "Quite at ease with anything. And you want to be." "I think I'm learning to be." She looked at him. "It's slower than I expected." "Most worthwhile things are," he said. She thought about that for a while. The fire shifted, settled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in the dark with the long sound it made when the temperature was dropping. The letter from Denver arrived at the Valley Trading Post in the second week of December, forwarded from the address Clara had left with Marshall Hayes. The supply rider brought it up with their monthly provisions, and Thorne brought it to her without opening it, which she noted. It was from Hayes's office. The trial date had been set for February. Her testimony was requested in person. A second letter, enclosed, was from a lawyer in Denver, a name she didn't know, offering to represent her interests in the civil proceedings that a colleague was preparing in parallel with the criminal case. The lawyer wrote in the careful, formal language of legal correspondence. But the content was clear enough. There was a case to be made against the Mercer family for damages, and there were people willing to make it. She read both letters twice at the table, then set them down. "February," she said. "I know," Thorne said. He was standing by the window, not looking at her, giving her the room to process it. I'll need to go to Denver. Yes. It could take a while. The trial. She looked at the letters. Weeks, maybe. I know. She looked up at him. You can't come to Denver for weeks. He turned from the window. Why not? The cabin, the animals, the cabin will be here when we get back, he said. The animals can be managed. There's a family in the valley, the Peterson family. They've looked after this place for me before when I've been gone. They're good people. He paused. I'm not letting you go to Denver alone. She looked at him. Thorn, she said. Clara, he said, in exact the same tone, which was as close as he got to a joke. She picked up the letters and put them carefully on the shelf where she kept the things that mattered. Then she crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, looking out at the snow-covered meadow, the bare aspen grove at the far edge, the high ridgeline white and clear against the winter sky. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. When you found me in the telegraph office, She stopped, working for the right words because this mattered and she wanted to get it right. I had stopped expecting anything, not just from the town, from anyone. I think I had decided that what happened to me was going to be the version that got recorded and that there was nothing I could do about it. She paused. I wasn't giving up exactly. I had run out of the kind of energy it takes to believe that the truth matters to anyone besides the person it happened to. He was very still beside her. And then you walked in and looked at my feet, she said. And you asked me how long I'd been running a fever. She shook her head slightly. Of all the things, that was the thing. I just saw what was there, he said. I know, she said. That's the whole point. Everyone else saw what was there and decided not to. You saw it and couldn't not act on it. She looked at him. I've been thinking about why that is. What makes a person like that? I'm not, he started. Don't, she said. Don't tell me you're not anything. You did what you did. You can own it. He was quiet for a moment. A very slight expression crossed his face. The same almost smile she'd seen in profile that first day on the trail. The one that didn't quite complete itself. My father, he said slowly. Before everything with the land, before he became smaller. He paused. He used to say that the only thing you controlled in this life was whether you were the person who stopped or the person who kept walking. That everything else, how it came out, whether people thanked you, whether it cost you something, none of that was yours to control, just the stopping. She thought about that. He sounds like he was a good man, she said. He was, Thorne said. For a long time he was. The loss in how he said it was quiet and old, the particular grief of someone who had watched a person change in ways they couldn't stop. She didn't try to address it with words, because there weren't words for that kind of thing that didn't make it smaller. She just stood beside him at the window, and after a while he put his arm around her shoulders. Not a dramatic gesture, not careful or deliberate, just the natural movement of someone closing a distance that had been getting smaller for weeks. And she leaned into it, and they stood there looking at the mountain. The trial took place in Denver in February over 11 days. Clara had expected it to be worse than it was, and it was still bad. The defense lawyers, Aldous Mercer had hired the best available, which in the Colorado Territory of 1882 meant men who were skilled at making victims seem unreliable, worked through every angle they could find. They questioned her memory of the night. They questioned her character. They raised her work history, her independence, her lack of family in the area, as though the absence of people to vouch for her was itself a form of evidence against her. One of them, a smooth-faced man from Philadelphia who clearly found the whole affair beneath him, suggested in measured legal language that her injuries might be consistent with an accident involving a horse, and Clara had looked at him across the courtroom and said, clearly and without heat, I did not own a horse. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Gavin Mercer was found guilty on all counts. She was sitting in the corridor outside the courtroom when Hayes came out and told her. Thorne was beside her, had been beside her for every one of the 11 days, present in the gallery, present in the evenings in the boarding house near the courthouse where they stayed, present in the practical and undemonstrative way that was his only way of being present. When Hayes said the words, she didn't cry. She had not expected to cry. What she felt was something more internal than that, a settling, like a foundation finding its level after a long time of being slightly off. "Sentencing in 2 weeks," Hayes said. "You don't need to be here for it, but you can be if you want." "I'll be here," she said. She looked at Thorne. He looked back at her. "Well," she said. "Yeah," he said. It was not an eloquent moment, but she had learned over the months since October to distrust eloquent moments. They had a way of being performed rather than felt, arranged rather than lived. What was real was this: a corridor outside a courthouse in Denver in February, the gas lamps on the walls, the sound of people moving in the rooms beyond the doors, a woman who had been left on a rocky trail at midnight and had dragged herself back toward the lights not once but many times in many forms, and the man who had walked into her telegraph office and refused to look away. "Let's get some coffee," she said. "Your coffee? Or mine?" "Yours is undrinkable." "You've been drinking it for 4 months." "I've been tolerating it," she said. "There's a difference." He held the door open for her, and they went out into the cold Denver morning. The civil case against the Mercer family settled before it went to trial, in the spring. The settlement amount was not made public, but it was enough. Enough for Clara to buy a piece of land in the valley below the cabin. Enough for the things she'd started to think about, the things that arrived in your mind when survival stopped being the full-time occupation and there was space left over for something else. Aldous Mercer resigned from the Territorial Land Board in March. His political influence, which had been the architecture of an entire town's compliance and an entire family's impunity, collapsed with remarkable speed once the first structural element gave way. It always worked like that. Fear was the mortar that held those structures together, and once people understood that the fear had been the point, not justice, not order, not community, just fear dressed up as those things, the rebuilding came faster than anyone expected. Not complete, not clean, but real. Dr. Haverford lost his license in April. He moved to a smaller settlement 2 days north and worked as a general laborer for the first year, which was a humbling and probably accurate consequence. Clara heard this from Hayes, who sent occasional updates in his practical, unembellished way. She read the update and put it on the shelf and did not dwell on it long. Haverford had made a choice, and then made a different one, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and that was the complicated nature of people. Redstone Crossing got a new telegraph operator by summer, a young man from back east who sent his first transmission in May and whose timing was reportedly decent, if not as fast as his predecessors had been. Clara read this in a letter from Mrs. Aldridge, who had begun writing sporadically after the trial, short letters, factual, not asking for anything. Clara wrote back in the same register. They would probably never be friends, but they were corresponding, which was something. Not resolution exactly, more like two people acknowledging that they had been in the same story and had not played the same role in it, and that the story was over now, and they were both still here. That, too, was something. Mund. The summer was warm at elevation in a way she hadn't experienced before. Not hot the way towns were hot, with the trapped heat of packed buildings and animal and human density, but a clean, high-altitude warmth that felt like something earned by altitude rather than simply existing. She learned to walk the trails properly, with her weight distributed in the way Thorne had shown her, reading the terrain with her feet before her eyes. Her ankles healed completely by June, truly completely, not the partial healing she'd been managing since October, but the kind where one day you simply noticed that you hadn't thought about them in 3 days. She noticed the day she didn't think about them. She stood still for a moment in the middle of the meadow and paid attention to it. Then she went back to what she had been doing, which was learning to set a snare, which she was not yet good at, and which Thorne had shown her twice with a patience that was real rather than performed. "You're pulling it too tight," he said, from where he was crouched a few feet away. "It needs to give when it catches, not resist." "I know what it needs," she said. "I'm not getting there yet." "You'll get there. You're very confident in my abilities." "I've seen what you can do when you decide to learn something," he said. "You're relentless about it." She looked up at him. "Is that a compliment or a complaint?" "Observation," he said, which was his standard answer for those questions, and she laughed. The real laugh, the unguarded one, the one that had come back somewhere in the spring after a long absence, and which still sometimes surprised her when she heard it in herself. There were still bad nights. She had not expected them to stop completely, and they hadn't. Nights when she woke with her heart going and the darkness of the cabin pressing too close, and the specific quality of fear that came not from the present, but from the body's memory of a past it hadn't finished processing. On those nights she lay still and breathed until it passed, and sometimes Thorn woke too, and he woke easily, she had always known that, and said nothing, just let her know by some quality of his stillness that he was awake, and that the cabin was safe, and that she was not on that trail in the dark by herself. She had told him once, in the spring, that she was sorry for waking him. He had looked at her like that was the strangest thing she'd said since he'd known her. "Don't apologize for that," he said. "Ever. It's Clara." Not sharp, just direct. "You spent 11 days alone with something that would have broken most people. The fact that your body is still working through it isn't a problem you need to apologize to me for." She had looked at him in the dark of the cabin, the fire down to coals, the mountain quiet outside. "You're a strange man, Thorn Callahan," she said. "I've been told that before," he said. "I mean it as a compliment." "I know," he said. "Go back to sleep." She had. In August, she sat down at the small table in the cabin and wrote a letter to Marshal Hayes that was not about legal proceedings. She wrote it in the early morning while Thorn was doing his circuit, the light coming in through the south window, the sound of the spring outside, the mountain going about its enormous patient business all around her. She wrote about the land she'd bought in the valley, about the things she was learning, about what it felt like to live somewhere that was hers, in the particular way that places become yours, not through deed or transaction, but through the accumulated knowledge of them, their moods, their rhythms, what they asked of you in different seasons. She wrote, "I thought, for a long time, that what had happened to me in October was going to be the defining fact of my life, the thing that everything afterward would be organized around. I understand now that it is a fact of my life. It happened, it is real, it shaped what came after, but it is not the whole story. I am more than what was done to me. I think I always was. I just needed enough distance from the immediate survival of it to be able to see that clearly." She paused. "Read it back." Then she wrote, "The distance, it turned out, was a mountain, and the person who helped me get there was a trapper from Ohio who looked at my feet and asked the right question at the right time. I'm not sure he fully understands what that meant. I'm going to spend some time making sure he does." She folded the letter and sealed it and set it on the shelf for the next supply ride down to the valley. Thorn came back in from his circuit, stomped the trail dust off his boots at the door, came inside. He looked at her at the table and then at the letter on the shelf. "Hayes?" he said. "Hayes," she confirmed. "He went to put coffee on. It would be too strong. She would drink it anyway because some things you adjusted to and some things you chose to adjust to because the person who made them was worth the adjustment, and there was a difference between those two categories that she had learned to recognize." "Thorn," she said. He looked at her over his shoulder. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in the old, familiar way, and the mountain held everything in its enormous, indifferent patience. The cabin, the spring, the meadow gone gold with August, the woman at the table and the man at the stove, and the whole complicated, imperfect, ongoing fact of two people building something in a difficult place because they had decided it was worth building. "You'd have done the same," he said. She thought about it, about the woman she'd been when he'd walked into the telegraph office, and the woman she was now, and everything in the distance between those 2 points. "I hope so," she said. "I think I'm getting there." He brought the coffee to the table. She wrapped her hands around the cup, too strong, as always, and looked out the south window at the high peaks, white and clear and permanent against the blue Colorado sky, and she thought about her mother, who had survived everything and never quite found ease. And she thought, "I am going to do better than survive. I'm going to live in this place, in this life, with this difficult and good man, and I'm going to be at ease in it. Not because it would be perfect. Nothing was perfect. Not the healing that still had bad nights in it, not the man who made undrinkable coffee and slept lightly and carried Ohio with him like a stone in his pocket, not the mountain that was beautiful and indifferent and asked everything of you without apology, but real. Fully, completely, irrevocably real. And real, she had learned, was the only thing worth building your life on. The story of what had happened in Redstone Crossing would exist in federal records now, in the official version, the true version. Gavin Mercer's conviction, the doctor's confession, the town's failure named and documented. That version would outlast everyone involved in it. It would outlast the town itself, probably. It was the answer to the lie that Deputy Crane had told her on that first night when he'd looked at her broken and shaking by the water trough and called it an accident. It had not been an accident, and the truth of that had been worth every difficult thing it cost to make it official. She drank the coffee. Outside, the mountain went on being a mountain. She went on being herself, not the woman who had been dragged and left and survived, though she was that too, would always be that. But Clara Whitlock, who had come a long way from a narrow telegraph office in a frightened town, who had learned to walk mountain trails and set snares and read the wind off the high ridgeline, who had found, in the least expected place and the least expected company, the thing she had not known she was looking for until she was already standing inside it. Not rescue. She had never needed rescue, just someone who stopped.